did all these miracles. Ken's site is called Jesus Never Existed. It is not called Jesus the Wonder Worker of the Gospels Never Existed. If he was simply addressing that issue, then he would have no issue at all with the testimony of Tacitus, because Tacitus doesn't testify that Jesus did any miracles. So let's make it clear. If we're going to discuss, did a person named Jesus exist who led the Christian movement, crucified under Pilate, etc., then that is an entirely different issue as to whether Jesus was a miracle worker, because they could have agreed that he worked miracles, but done like Celsus, attributed it to Egyptian magic or some other such thing. Again, why would we have someone, again, like Bart Ehrman, who agrees that Jesus existed as a person, and he is an agnostic, professed agnostic, but he does not agree, of course, that Jesus did any miracles. And you can't say he has some confessional interest because he is an agnostic. And then you say, well, it's left over from the time he was a fundamentalist. Well, I agree he has some leftover fundamentalism in him, but at this point you have to say, well, what about someone like Robert Price? Obviously he broke out of that and became objective. Well, now you're simply going to essentially go to an ad hominem against Bart Ehrman. He just can't clear his mind of that one thing.
You're saying that Ken has a very, if you like, presumably he claims Christians have vested interests in putting the record for Jesus in a good light. Are you saying that Ken is equally in the other direction, drawing on the very, very most out there kind of theories and possibilities of history to put this case together?
I don't use people's motives in my arguments unless it's something obvious or unless I want to make a point, which is not very often with that. I mean, my point is that appealing to people's motives and biases and interests is simply a distraction from the evidence. And you can interpret interest in many ways. You can say, well, because they had an interest, they invented a person named Jesus. Well, their interest could also motivate them to report the historically accurate fact that Jesus existed. Motive can cause any number of reactions, whether real ones or fake ones. And so it's really a straw man is what it is. It's a diversion from the evidence to appeal to people's confessional interests or their biases.
I mean, you yourself have admitted, Ken, that you're in a minority position. And the vast majority of biblical scholars out there are not making these kinds of claims, no. and then you're putting on them that, well, that's just because there's been such an overriding assumption in the historical fact of Jesus. I mean, we have historians here who aren't kind of tied to some kind of belief in Christianity like Bart Ehrman.
We're all on a voyage. I mean, Bart Ehrman has gone from a fundamentalist Christian to this agnostic now, who may still believe in a historical Jesus at this moment in time, but he's still a relatively young man. Maybe in 10 years' time he'll explain why he lost faith in a historical Jesus. We don't know that yet. We all evolve in our ideas. Hopefully, I certainly have. I mean, I've said this on your show before, Justin. At one stage, if we put the clock back long enough, I would have just said, as everybody else would, oh, there's probably a historical Jesus, because you can make that comment without fear of contradiction and without one iota of evidence. Now, the point is, I have no axe to grind in whether there was or wasn't a historical Jesus. I simply found that there wasn't. When I started to investigate and tried to find him, I found I couldn't. And I wasn't the first to do that, because scholars have been doing that for 200 years. They've discovered that there is no historical Jesus. That's why some of them, like Rudolf Bultmann, said, give up on the looking for it, concentrate on Christ. Okay, let's move the argument on then. I think it is valid to press the point about evidence simply because we are talking about someone for whom at least minimalistic claims have to be made. We're not simply saying he put together a chair or a table because he was a carpenter. We are saying he caused the world to be turned upside down, as the book of Acts puts it. People's lives were transformed, as the apologists always keep telling us. They suffered unto death so they would maintain because of this faith. So there supposedly was something there that was more than just another carpenter. Now, that is what I say there is no evidence of. And when we get into the 2nd century witnesses, such as we did with Tacitus, we're really not talking about Jesus at all. We're talking about Christians and people who had a certain belief system. Now, let's move on to the subject of the Gospels then, because, we have certain problems there. We do not have first-hand copies from eyewitnesses of these extraordinary events. We have the very opposite of that. We don't have any complete Bibles before the 4th century. We have a few fragments from the 3rd, and then various textual references of it in a bewildering variety from the 2nd. Now, all that suggests to me that in the early century, that is probably the 2nd century, there was a struggle for an understanding of what they would interpret to be Jesus and his story and the Christ, and that was a battle of ideas finally resolved in the favour of orthodoxy. And when we look at the Gospels, what we have today is the testimony of the winners in a very acrimonious and violent debate.
JP, is that the way you see the way that the New Testament canon has come to us?
No, and I'm going to briefly comment on those last points before I go into the Gospels.
Go ahead.
We'll see Bart Ehrman in 10 years. Well, G.A. Wells changed over away from the idea that Jesus didn't exist, so maybe in 10 years we'll see Ken Humphreys change his mind as well, and we'll use that as a basis.
We'll certainly have him on again if that happens.
Certainly, yeah, I suppose so. Inevitably, though, again, if this is just... We could use some of these same arguments that he's using about the Gospels and turn them around and use them for Gamaliel. We don't have any first-hand copies of the Talmud. We can see a struggle between the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and these other Jewish groups happening. And we can say that Gamaliel was invented by the Pharisees to give themselves legitimacy. I mean, when it comes to this kind of idea, you can suggest anything you want to in order to come up for some reason why there was some sort of tampering done. And so, this, like I say, this is simply it's contrived methodology in history. It's not based on evidence. It's based on a presupposition that something has happened, and we need to find out what.
I would comment on that the presupposition is on your own part, JP. I mean, you are a committed Christian. You take pride in being the hardest sitting apologist and the rest of it. I mean, I have already confessed the fact that my opinion changed. I thought there was an historical Jesus until I tried to find the evidence of one. I'm not dogmatic on the point. If in 10 years' time I find evidence for an historical Jesus, I'll be very happy to come on this show and explain why. But the problem is I'm not seeing them. I'm not hearing them from you. You know, I'm hearing defences, but I don't hear any strong evidence here for an historical Jesus, and we have a much more plausible explanation for why in the 2nd century there was such fractional division in the Christian movement. There were so many contending factions and heresies because they didn't know what to believe until it was hammered out, and then it became authorised in their various Gospels that are now in the book we have today.
JP?
Now, these are very vague summary statements that really don't make an argument for anything whatsoever. And if we want to, again, I don't play the game of confessional interest or bias or what have you, saying, I'm a committed Christian, well, Bart Ehrman is not, and therefore then what? Well, he was brainwashed and he's still brainwashed now, etc. We could just as easily say, and this is said tongue-in-cheek, well, Ken has a website and he's trying to sell a book and he's trying to sell T-shirts and mugs or what have you, and therefore he has a reason to defend this point of view. I'm not actually saying that's why he's doing it, but if we want to play this game of he has an interest, he has a bias, that's why he's defending it, again, it's simply a diversion from the evidence. Now, we're talking here about different views of the Gospels. I like what he said about history is written by the winners. I remember Dan Brown saying something like that. My general reply, polemically speaking, is, yes, it's written by the winners and complained about by the losers. But let's see. What do we have in terms of these fractions?
The losers are dead, actually.
So are the winners, for that matter, in many ways. But let's say, if you want to talk about, say, the Gospels in particular, we don't have first-hand copies, no, and we don't have first-hand copies of any of these ancient works, and yet I've yet to see any historian or any scholar make an issue of this for any secular work. We don't have first-hand copies of any of the works of Confucius. We don't have first-hand copies of any African poems written by some of their ancient people. This is simply not an issue, and that's why we do textual criticism.
I mean, on that basis, I've often heard it said that, in fact, while people like Ken may make some issue about we only have later copies, in fact, the copies we have are dated a lot earlier than many of the manuscripts we have for evidence of other great historical characters. We have closer and better manuscripts than many other historical characters.
Well, yeah, now we don't have time to get into all the details. That's in my next book, but if you're going to make comparative claims, then if you're going to throw out the New Testament, and you're going to have to throw out every other major historical work from the ancient world, including Tacitus, including Livy, including Suetonius, and including the Talmud. It's all going to become a blank slate, and we may as well adhere to the